And joining us now on the debate for the full hour tonight, in New York, Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School. In our nation's capital, Piotr Dutkiewicz, professor of political science at Carleton University. And here in our studios in Toronto, Piotr Wrobel, professor of history at the University of Toronto. Jeffrey Kopstein, director at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the U of T. And Sergei Plekhanov, professor of political science at York University. And I welcome everybody back to the studio here and in Points Beyond to our broadcast tonight. Let's start by acknowledging that the cynic in us probably thinks of political gestures as empty theater, but tonight's program is about, in part, a gesture that could be anything but cynical. Let's bring this picture up that was seen around the world. Remember this shot? Right here, the embrace between the prime ministers of Poland and Russia, Donald Tusk and Vladimir Putin, at the site of the air crash which killed the Polish president, Lech Kaczynski, his wife, and an entourage of 94 people. They were on their way to commemorate the deaths of more than 20,000 Polish soldiers who were shot by the Soviet secret police, the so-called NKVD, in the Katyn forest in 1940. Piotr Wrobel, I want to go to you first. How would you describe the reaction in Poland to that response from the Russian leader?
The first reaction was very good. We could see that there is sympathy, that there is empathy. Some people were even surprised because this was definitely a new phase of Putin.
You said the first reaction.
Yes, because now reactions change and less people believe in a real revolution in terms of Polish-Russian relations.
Okay, Sergei, to you then. How would you describe the reaction by Russians to the crash?
Well, I can go by opinion polls, and they indicate that the overwhelming majority of the Russians reacted with horror and sympathy. It's like 65% sympathy or even empathy, and 20% horror. And in fact, the positive ratings in attitudes to Poland have also jumped up. So, you're looking at the picture of Russian opinion on Poland, and you get this overwhelming positive sentiment mixed with the sense of condolences, sympathy, empathy, and whatever.
Jeffrey, just before I bring you in, I want to play a clip from a movie called Katyn by renowned Polish director Andrzej Wajda, and this is about the events of 70 years ago. We'll play the clip, then I'll ask you a question. Roll tape, please.
Ludzie! Dokąd idziecie? Przecież za nami Niemcy! Sowieci! Sowieci wkroczyli! Dokąd idziecie? Zawracajcie! Ruscy wkroczyli!
I'm sure that many people did not know about these events of 70 years ago. People today, we have obviously a lot of younger viewers and new Canadians who watch this program. So paint the picture of the historical context in which all of the events that have taken place in the last couple of weeks find themselves.
Right, so in September 1939, the Germans invade Poland. Very briefly after that, the Russians, from the west, the Germans invade Poland. From the east, very short, within weeks after that, the Russians invade. And the Poles find themselves caught between these two great powers, Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. And Poland found itself, yet again, dismembered by these two great and evil powers at the time. And really what this moment, what you saw is they were caught on a bridge and they didn't know where to go. Do you run back to Germany and be slaughtered? Or do you go to Russia and be slaughtered? And so really this caught this kind of moment of primal fear. And most Canadians don't understand what it is to live in fear, right? And the Poles at this very moment had this choice, what to do. And they found themselves caught between these places and they didn't know what to do.
Well, Polish Jews didn't know what to do. They ran to Russia and they were saved there. At least those of them who were not invaded by the Germans later.
Not all of them, though. there were Jews in 1939, in 1940, who still believed that it would be better on the German side.
That's right.
Let me read something that Norman Davies wrote just the day after all of the events that we're talking about today. Up till now, Katyn stood as an allegory of tragedies suffered by Poland for centuries at the hands of its neighbors and allies. It has become a focus of all evil done to Poland in the last century. Now, an additional chapter has been added to this drama-filled history. This chapter, though, deals with an unbelievable turnaround. Witnessing this gigantic transformation in Polish-Russian relations, I cannot believe that I have lived to see it. Relations between both countries have a chance to become the best they have ever been. And this is not a utopian fantasy. This is happening before our eyes, and you have to be blind not to notice it. Now, hang on. Let's go to Professor Dutkiewicz in Ottawa on this one. Given the history of mistrust and suspicion between Poles and Russians, how do you react to those comments of Norman Davies, which were said, or which were written, rather, just one day after the crash?
Positively, because despite the history of our relations, I believe that we can turn the page. It will be very difficult to turn this page. It's a lot of things that divides us. We have very much entrenched our thinking in the history, or our identity is shaped by the history. In fact, what Norman Davies is saying is we have too much of the history in Eastern Europe. We have too little of pragmatism, of tolerance, and of skills of diplomacy. Maybe this tragedy will turn the page and we'll see the new phase in our relations. And it's already started. Because during the last year, there were two meetings between both prime ministers, Prime Minister Putin and Prime Minister Tusk, one in Gdańsk and another in Katyn. And during both, we saw something which I would describe as unbelievable thing. They were talking normal language, not hostile language, but language of reconciliation.
Okay,
so,
let me get Nina Khrushcheva in at this point. I wonder how you view the possibility of age-old suspicions potentially being swept away by the feelings of mourning and empathy which have resulted because of this crash.
Well, I mean, I think they are swept away at this point, but I would agree with the earlier comment that primarily, originally, it was a very, very positive thing, and now when politics may kick in, I don't know how long it's going to last. So I am cautiously optimistic about those changes, but I also think there's too much history, and also there's a lot of politics on both sides, and we will see how this politics plays out, because the minute sympathy, empathy, understanding of a common tragedy starts being hampered by national interests, we'll see how far sympathy will go.
Okay, you'll forgive this personal question as a follow-up here, Nina, but let's say this gently. You grew up in a fairly political household. People recognize your last name, they know who your grandfather was. Do you remember growing up in that household what you thought of Polish people?
No, I actually would not remember that because I was very little. Nikita Khrushchev was my great-grandfather, and I really didn't discuss any politics with him. In fact, my relations with Poland happened much later here in New York City, when I met a lot of Poles and was completely fascinated and overwhelmed by the absolutely wonderful character of the nation. Then I visited Warsaw, but it was my own rather than actually sort of anything related to Khrushchev.
Now, you couldn't hear this, Nina, but Piotr Wrobel, when I asked that question, I think your eyes went up to the heavens and you thought, oh my goodness, why are you asking that? So why the reaction?
Let's introduce some framework here. We are dealing with emotions on one hand and with cold interests on the other hand. And emotions are important, but real interests are more important.
And you prefer we stick to the real interests?
And this is why I am really cautious. I do believe that this is a small step, and I do believe that there will be certain improvement, but interests will return very soon, or actually they have already returned.
Well, let's see. Piotr Dutkiewicz, you've taken a look at some recent public opinion surveys of Polish attitudes towards Russians that were done before the crash. What can you tell us about what you found?
Very interesting. It was done in late March, so before the crash, and 33% of Poles would like to improve relations with Russia. And similar polls done in Russia says that 47% of the Russians before the crash were opted for the better relations with Poland. Obviously, there is a very small margin of those who think in the entirely different way. About 5 to 8% of both Poles and the Russians almost hate each other. They have a high level of hostility to whatever is related to each country. And in the middle are quite a large group of those undecided. So even before the crash, even before this wave of the sympathy related to the tragedy, both countries, I think, they have a lot in common, means that we have to improve relations, not because of the crash, but because of the cold interest, as some of you said.
Okay, Sergei Plekhanov?
Whenever we talk about national interest, we have to keep in mind that national interest is the way the politicians, political elites define them, right? So to say that national interests of Poland are somehow immutable realities which would push the countries apart, I think is totally wrong. In fact, I think what we're seeing now is a recasting of the perception of the interests of Russia and Poland vis-à-vis each other. And the tragedy at Smolensk has actually contributed to this rethink. And I think I'm quite optimistic about the possibilities of serious improvements between Russia and Poland, precisely because national interests, properly understood, of both Russia and Poland, as well as the larger set of interests of Europe, interests of East-West relations improving, interests of the United States and Russia, are all aligned in favor of the, détente between Russia and Poland.
But as far as the crash?
Of course, of course. I mean, it started before the. By the way, Piotr said something. Piotr Dutkiewicz in Otto said something about the Polish opinion on Russia. I checked out the polls of Russians.
How are you spelling the word polls in that case?
Polls.
Public opinion polls or
public
Polish
opinion
people?
polls. Okay. Good point. Polls on Russian polls on the polls. Okay. It's remarkable. 60%, between 50 and 60% of Russians think of Poland as a partner, right? 20% of Russians thinks of Poland as an ally. I mean, is that a hangover from Soviet times when they were on the, and only a minority, 20% think of Poles negatively. Poland as an enemy
Kopstein.
and so on and so forth.
So it's interesting, for the 20 years after the fall of communism, Poland was really interested in facing West. That it really wanted to forget everything to do with Russia. Russia was bad, Russia was the oppressor, and they were just going to simply face West. And they really concentrated on getting in the European Union and passing the 80,000 pages of the acquis communautaire into their national law, and they concentrated on getting into NATO, and they concentrated on being a good ally with the United States, which is why they sent soldiers to Iraq,
and they
of
did
all
all
places.
three.
Yeah, and they did all three, and they succeeded at that. What's interesting here is this 70th anniversary of the Katyn massacre. It really provided the opportunity to face eastward. And that's what we're really talking about here, is Poland now facing eastward. And what Poland interestingly did after communism, Poland has its own Ostpolitik, if you will. Every summer, the University of Warsaw has this Eastern Institute where they invite in young people from all over, from Belarus, from Lithuania, from Moldova, from Russia, from Ukraine, to create a kind of a cadre of people who are focused in on Poland. And of course, the Polish president supported the revolution, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. He flew to Georgia when the Georgians invaded. So the Polish president has really, Poland has been focused on being a kind of a west, the easternmost Western ally. And what really the Katyn episode has done is it has provided Poland an opportunity to turn eastward again. And I think the meaning of the air crash here is it made this moment all the more poignant, right? It kind of solidified it in a way that we might not have been paying attention to it as much.
Let me give an example here. Here is the day after the tragedy. We're in a new age, right? Text messages are flying all over the place. people in Poland started receiving text messages such as this one. History has come full circle. Poland, as the Christ of nations, is returning. Let us be united by this love from God. Piotr Wrobel, it seems that the air crash here is seen as divinely inspired. Why do people in Poland think in those terms?
These are emotions, again. And Jeff mentioned some events which happened after the fall of communism, events which were very good to Poland. But look, it was very difficult to withdraw Russian forces from Poland. A lot of problems. Then Russia was very unhappy about Poland joining NATO and did some diplomatic tricks we didn't like. At the same time, there was a massive military buildup in the Kaliningrad region. Then Poland joined the European Union. Russia was very unhappy about Poland joining the European Union. And finally, well, let's mention Ukraine, what's going on right now in Ukraine. Poles watch the Ukrainian situation very carefully, and they are very unhappy about Russian victories in Ukraine right now. So we are not talking only about past history, about communism, about years ago. We are talking about the contemporary situation as well. And the contemporary situation is not entirely optimistic, clear, and very good from the Polish point of view.
Sergei?
Yeah, the Poles have a tradition of thinking of Ukrainians as their serfs. You know, the Poles were the gentry, and the people, they were the Ukrainians. And the Russians have a similar attitude to Ukrainians as being part and parcel of the Russian Empire. Now, let's face it, Poland and Russia faced each other off in Central Europe for several centuries, and they were competing there. But I want to make another point. You mentioned God, and that's...
But your words about Polish attitude towards Ukraine were quite strong, you have to admit.
I was exaggerating.
Yes,
and
you
don't
were
agree with
exaggerating.
you don't agree with them?
Right now, most Poles believe that independent and stable Ukraine is very important to Poland.
Okay, let me get back on the issue of this kind of religiosity that has been infused in the situation. Okay, Sergei, pick up on that.
There's a fascinating new dialogue between the Polish Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. The Patriarch of the Russian Church is visiting Warsaw next month. They are setting up a commission, and interestingly enough, in that commission, which will discuss all the issues which have traditionally divided the Russian and the Poles and the two churches, there will be representatives of Russian Catholics on the Russian side and Polish Orthodox on the Polish side. Now, this is something entirely new and very promising, given the fact that of all the institutions in the Russian society, the church is above everybody else. I mean, they trust the church more than any other institution. So when the churches begin to align, and not to mention the influence of the Catholic Church in Poland, a very powerful institution. So this is civil societies moving toward each other, engaging in dialogue and so on. So, I mean, apparently God is on the side of Polish-Russian reconciliation.
Let me get Piotr Dutkiewicz on that same issue. Go ahead.
I would like to shift a bit from the emotional and divine powers who are ruling our relations and turn to the more pragmatic issues. To me, at stake is much more than the Russian-Polish relations, and the Russia will not have a good relations with European Union or generally with the West without normalizing relations with Poland.
Right.
And therefore, for Russians, it is important to have good relations with Poland because then they will be able to move further with the European opening. That's first. This is also very important for Russia itself. The Katyn debate is not only debate about Poland. It's about Stalinism. It's about the totalitarianism. Right. It's about the long debate in Russia itself about what Stalinism means for Russia. This is so far a substitute of the internal Russian relation about their own past. So this tragedy goes much beyond the Polish-Russian relations. It's also about Poland, rethinking Polish-Russian relations, make them normal. So this tragedy triggered a lot of other issues that are fascinating to watch how they will unfold in the next few months.
Nina, let me ask you about this, though. Poles have struggled, I think it's fair to say, for 70 years to get the world to learn about the killings at Katyn, and now the world does know about them, but because of this awful tragedy, the world knows about them. How cruel an irony is that?
Well, it is a cruel irony, and there was a lot of talk about religious part of it, and it really is something absolutely uncanny. I don't want to involve God in this, but there is certainly something absolutely grand about this tragedy, precisely because if that is whatever Russia's policy would be, and I hope Sergei Plekhanov is correct, and Russian-Polish national interests would just unite, and it will all go into towards European direction. But if not, because I actually would never be surprised if Russia decides that Western opening is not working out and decides to go back into not Western opening or actually closing. So having said that, Katyn will never be hidden again. It would always now, forever and ever, it would be the NKVD crimes during the Second World War. And I think that maybe it is a humongous price to pay, and yet it's one of those checks in history that will never be unchecked.
Jeff.
You know, I agree with everything that's been said, and I think this is, you know, what I would only add to this. You know, one of the there are a couple of silver linings in all of this tragedy, and one of them is that for so long, the Poles only saw the dark side of Russia, the kind of the brutal side, and now what they really got to see, and I think the meaning of that embrace was they're seeing the kind of the nurturing side, the swaddling side of the Russian national character. And I realize that all of the interests are very important, and of course we're going to return to politics as usual pretty quickly. But the background culture that's nurtured by this, it's pretty important, and it can pop up in all kinds of other instances. There's one other silver lining that I would point to, and that is that after this crash took place, immediately the succession in Poland, all the institutions kind of worked. There was no talk of coups d'etat, of temporary emergency situations, of the military taking over. I mean, Poland had a coup d'etat in 1926, had a coup d'etat in 1981 as well. And so I think it's good that, you know, Polish institutions kind of worked. I mean, after all, you could think, I mean, this would be the equivalent in the United States in 2006 if a plane had crashed with George Bush and Cheney on board, and Nancy Pelosi had come to power, right? That was the equivalent. The person who came to power in Poland was going to be the primary opponent of President Kaczynski in the elections. And this was a kind of a case of democracy working. It's a kind of a triumph for democracy in Poland. I realize that's not the theme of the program, but it can provide a positive example to the Russians, that the Poles are seeing the good side of the Russian national character, and they're seeing that democratic national institutions can work in Poland. I think it's all these are positive things out of a tragedy.
Let me quote Norman Davies one more time. He writes, "I believe that Katyn will represent a catharsis for the entire Russian nation. This might sound odd," he says, "but Polish tragedies will open Russians up to their own past nightmares. You must remember that Stalin's regime of terror was primarily aimed at his countrymen. Events we are witnessing now will have a similar significance for Russians as Solidarity had in Poland. Knowledge about Katyn will have a similarly radicalizing effect. It might be hard to believe, but the truth about Stalin's crimes today is known only by a small elite of educated Russians. The rest live in complete ignorance of this history. As this will change, hold on, Sergei, let me finish it. As this will change, Russia will change, thanks to Katyn." Okay,
Steve,
Sergei.
with due respect to Professor Davies, this is total nonsense. The Russians have been debating Stalin and kind of trying to digest the truth about Stalin's crimes since 1956, in stages, right? And particularly in the past 20 years, to say that the vast majority of the Russians do not know, are not aware. I mean, it's enough to turn on the Russian TV and watch the stuff that is shown in Russian TV channels.
Well, let me follow up with Nina on that. Nina, the film Katyn that we showed a clip from earlier, it was shown previously on a very small television channel in Russia. But after the crash in Smolensk, Prime Minister Putin gave the nod for the film to be played on the largest Russian television channel that there is. Do we know what the impact of that was?
Well, actually, it wasn't shown on a very small TV channel. I mean, it wasn't entirely national, but it was a very important and respectable channel called Channel Kultura. I think I remember that it received about 14% of viewers, which probably very little, but together with the second showing on Sunday, which was very, very prime time on Channel 1, was about 8% of the whole population, or over 10, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but altogether it's up to 25% of the viewers that watched that film. And after the first showing, there was a debate, actually very good and very serious debate. After the second, there was no debate, but there was some responses of how the film was perceived by the viewers, and the major consensus was that the film was not anti-Russian, that the film was anti-Stalin, anti-KGB, anti those KGB crimes that were committed. So this is on a positive side. On a negative side, 22-25%, how many watched it, is really not that many. And a lot of people indeed decide not to go with those two showing, and watch some other crappy prime TV shows that they usually do on Sunday. And those 22%, in a sense, I mean, maybe a couple of percent here and there, 22% are already very much aware of Polish-Russian relations, very much aware of the Stalinist crimes, very much aware of what happened in Katyn and whatnot. So I'm not that sure that sort of the 100% of the Russian population all of a sudden is going to get enlightened.
I get you. Let me share some polls on. We talked polls on Poles earlier. Let's talk polls on Russians now. Okay. Here is March 2010. Who is responsible for the murder of Poles in Katyn? These are Russians who are asked. 53% had no opinion. 28% said the Nazis were responsible. 19% said Soviet leadership was responsible. Okay, then they did it again in April, so this is after. Who is responsible for the murder of Poles in Katyn? Still 47% had no opinion. This is after seeing the movie. 18% said the Nazis. 35% said the Soviet leadership.
Here you go.
Now, okay, Sergei, I got to go to Sergei on this. How do you explain the fact that even, okay, you say Russians have been debating for 50 years, 60 years, all about the past, and yet in that first poll, 53% of the people had no opinion about who was responsible for Katyn?
Katyn was not a much publicized story. I mean, you have to keep in mind, I mean, 20,000 Poles were killed at Katyn. 10 million Russians and other Soviets lost their lives at the hands of Stalin and his henchmen, right?
So that would naturally have a bigger...
My point is that Katyn nor Katyn, the crimes of the Stalin regime, is not a new story in Russia. And the Russians, it's not just the crimes, it's the nature of totalitarianism. How did we get into that? What's the continuity and break between Leninism and Stalinism? Can we explain the fact that Russia fell under the control of the communists for 78 years? All these issues are aired. If you go to the bookstores, if you read the newspapers, if you watch television channels, all those stories are prominently in the public mind. So Katyn adds an important feature to that.
I understand. Go ahead,
Well,
Piotr.
I'm a bit frustrated, I have to say, because, so to speak, the character of this crime, of the Katyn crime, was very peculiar, very special. It is one thing to die somewhere far away in the taiga because of malnutrition, because of temperature, because of difficult life. And another way is to be killed in such an industrial, cruel way they did it in Katyn. So the quality of the crime is different. But look, we are talking about Katyn, emotions, all those things. Most files concerning the Katyn crime are still closed by the Russian authorities.
Why would that be?
And they don't want to show those files to Polish historians, to Polish public. When, please tell me, eventually they will open this, right? Another point, this is not only about Russia. When I came to the United States in the late 80s, I was shocked that a large part of American history professors still believed that this was a German crime. To me, this was a shock. So I cannot advise anything to Prime Minister Putin, of course, but I think this would be a real step if eventually the Russian authorities did something about this Katyn story and reopened the case, started the real investigation, and put everything on a table.
Okay, let me get the other Piotr in Ottawa to respond, and then Jeff after that.
We are discussing the half glass full of water or empty. I believe that the Russians went a very long way to admitting that there was the crime that was committed by the Soviet NKVD. And both Putin and Medvedev acknowledge something which they didn't do before, means that they acknowledge that it was done by the totalitarian regime. Hearing these words from the two leaders working in tandem, in literally day by day, it's something which is new in the Russian politics. We are maximalists. We would like to get everything simultaneously, instantly. It doesn't work that way in the Russian politics. Russia is a huge country. It takes time. And we are pushing this to the level that I believe that some Russians are shaking their heads and they are saying, well, these Poles are demanding too much.
Jeff and then Sergei.
Takes too much time.
Okay,
Well,
Jeff Kopstein first.
I think what Medvedev and Putin have said in saying that there was a crime committed, this has to be acknowledged, right? They're committing the crime, condemning the crimes of Stalin. That has to be acknowledged. This is a positive thing. Piotr Dutkiewicz is correct. At the same time, there's a deep ambivalence in the Russian elite today about Stalin. And that ambivalence is reflected throughout the society, I should add. On the one hand, Stalin was bad. Crimes were committed that were bad. On the other hand, he's acknowledged and he's played up in school textbooks as being a great state builder. Right? One textbook, the main textbook that's actually used throughout Russia today, as being a great state builder, as defending the country against the Nazis, as being a kind of a necessary character, if you will, within Russian history. And I think this is this divided memory within Russia today over whether Stalin was a criminal or whether he was a great state builder, along the lines of Peter the Great or Ivan the Terrible, other great criminal state builders of Russian history.
He was both, right?
Right, but this is the problem because, of course, from the standpoint of the Poles, right, the fact that Stalin helped build a great state or even defeated the Nazis, this is actually not that much comfort to the Poles, given that a good chunk of their elite was wiped out in that forest in April 1940.
Sergei.
On the issue of opening the archives were opened for the first time, and the first admission of responsibility of the Soviet secret police and Stalinist regime for the murder at Katyn was made in 1990 by President Gorbachev. Then it was repeated with another batch of documents by President Yeltsin in 1994. Then it was repeated again 10 years later in 2004. And in 2004, the military prosecutor's office, that's the office responsible for the investigation, closed the case. And that was a very, very negative thing. So now a Russian court has accepted a lawsuit by a human rights organization, Memorial, demanding the reopening of all archives. And parallel to that, almost on the same day that lawsuit was accepted by the court, Prime Minister Putin actually made a pledge that the Russian government will open the archives, make all the documents available, provided that the Polish government would also respond by making all the documents available on the treatment of Russian POWs from the Soviet-Polish War of 1920.
Has that happened yet?
No, that's very recent, that a few days ago. But I think that we will see the reopening of the archives, and I can see that the talk about the treatment of Russian POWs in Poland in 1920 makes my friend Piotr uncomfortable, and I don't know why.
No, I wouldn't call this uncomfortable.
Why are you puffing?
Because I'm thinking about Gorbachev. And you mentioned him, and you said that he actually started this opening operation.
And he admitted the guilt.
You know what? At the same time, he called his historians, his top historians, and he told them, comrades, we are going to give the Poles some Katyn documents. Please find something which could be used as a counterbalance. And this is when the story of the Soviet POWs was maybe not reinvented, but found again. But what I want to emphasize very strongly, there is no slightest comparison between the Katyn crime and the fate of the Soviet POWs in the Polish camps in 1920.
Let me try this with Nina. Nina, we obviously are talking about two peoples here with a long history of conflict and different historical narratives. Where do you see the biggest obstacle in trying to soften the edges of this conflict at the moment?
I think that the open history is something that both countries should strive for, because if all the archives are open, if all the information is available, good, bad, and the ugly, I think that will really, really help to reconcile the relationship. I also agree with the church role in that, and I think Sergei Plekhanov was talking about it, and I think it's monumentally important that Russian Orthodoxy and Catholicism somehow will find common language, because the minute it's done, I think Russia will turn to the West in a much more open way. But in my experience, whatever historical problems country has, they have to admit mistakes, they have to admit crimes and guilt, and move forward. And I actually think that, I think Jeff was talking about it, the fact that Russia is very divided about Stalin and Stalinism, for example, for the anniversary of Second World War, which is happening right next month. There's going to be billboards with, supposedly billboards with Stalin on them for the first time since for years. And you know, how would you reconcile the two? You admit crimes, and at the same time you put a criminal on a billboard. So I think that the mistakes and understanding how the other side feels is probably something that we have to strive for.
Sergei, quick comeback here.
I think the billboards have been canceled. There were a few to be put up, and yeah, they have.
But well, I checked yesterday; they still were on.
They on in Moscow on display?
No. When I checked yesterday, there still was the talk that they're going to be up.
The decision was taken a week ago, but that's not. I think Jeff raised a very, very interesting point, an important point here, is that the Russians are still grappling with the legacy of Stalinism. It should not be dismissed out of hand that Stalin was the head of state at the time when Russia faced the most colossal tragedy, the Nazi invasion in its whole history. It was a challenge, existential challenge, and he was commander-in-chief. And of course, he was responsible for many blunders and unnecessary deaths and so on and so forth. It is a very difficult thing to cope with this. Was he a criminal? But he was a commander-in-chief. So he was a commander-in-chief, he was a criminal. Under Stalin, we defeated Nazi Germany, which was something, you know, no mean accomplishment. This is a process which will go on for a while. I wouldn't necessarily associate it with Russians going totalitarian.
We're going to get more of it, obviously, next month with the 65th anniversary of the end of the war.
But let me get us back. Or in spite of Stalin.
Yeah, let me get us back on Russia-Poland here. Hang on. Piotr Dutkiewicz, I want to bring you in on this. We have
Before going to Katyn, Russian Academy of Science Institute of Sociology asked Russians, should Putin apologize to Poles? 47% said no way. Don't apologize to Poles for Katyn. And Putin apologized to Katyn. Show me the politicians who is going against 47% of its own population.
One who doesn't ever face the electorate.
Did he?
That's who I would show you, the politician.
Did he really apologize?
Yeah.
Did he really apologize?
But he didn't apologize. Yes. He actually did. He didn't.
No, he did not apologize. He simply called it a crime.
He didn't.
No, he didn't apologize.
How do you read it if not an apology? I am quoting. We bow our heads to those who bravely met death here from the totalitarian regime.
This is not an apology.
It's not an
apology. He
apology.
bows his head.
No.
It's an admission. Admission is not an apology.
Is not an apology.
Okay. Well, as long as we're on the track here of potentially ruining this era of good feeling, there are some more potential cracks in all of this, and I want to raise a couple of them here. Jeff, I'll go to you first on this. Some Russians think that the Polish pilot of the plane was at fault, and that's why it crashed.
Right.
Some Poles are blaming the so-called incompetence of Russian air traffic controllers for the crash in Smolensk. There are other, even wackier, and we don't have to get into them here, but there are other really wacky conspiratorial theories that are going on out there right now. Does the risk of all of that, or does all of that risk overwhelming some of the positive developments that have taken place in the last few weeks?
Yeah, a little bit, not that much. I mean, you pointed to the biggies, a combination of incompetence, the pilot who should have not tried to land, and just bad luck. That's I think the common explanation. But yes, I mean, part of it is this could kind of turn bad, and part of it could be involved in that Poland's about to have an election, and Kaczynski, by the way, was about to lose that election. He was going to lose, and his brother has announced that he's going to run for
Just
president.
remind everybody, the Kaczynski who died was about to lose. His twin brother
is
Yaroslav
now
going to contest and probably win.
Well, I don't think he's actually going to win.
You don't think he's going to win?
I think he's going to lose. But the campaign itself, there will be all kinds of nonsense that gets put out there saying that the other side, right, were backed by the Russians, and the reason why Lech Kaczynski was killed by the Russians was in order to bring the other side to power. Now, I think I have enough confidence in Polish political culture at this point that that's actually not going to lead to any really bad place. But of course, after an election campaign, there can be all kinds of bad feelings.
Piotr, what do you think?
It's a good point. I'm afraid of this election campaign. We cannot exclude anything, really, even a huge success of Jarosław Kaczyński. We cannot exclude it. Although I feel a bit bad here because I think we should emphasize those good consequences of the tragic event. And I feel partially responsible for pessimistic mood here. Yes, this was an important step, a small step, but important step on the way to reconciliation. And yes, we historians, intellectuals, we should do our best to work on this reconciliation, to put Russians and Poles closer. And I want to emphasize this, that probably most Poles, even though they are afraid of Russia, do realize that Russians have been the first victim of Stalinism and communism. And there is a lot of empathy for the Russians in Poland. And we feel that we are close in terms of culture, in terms of belief, in terms of emotions. This is our common way of reacting. So let's work on this. But there will be no revolution.
Nina, let me get you to weigh in on that issue of whether the potential era of good feeling that has been created by this tragedy runs the risk of going south because of some of the accusations that are going back and forth now between the two sides.
It could be. I mean, I agree with the previous speakers, those who talked about this, because I think it is unfortunate that it did happen. But what I mean, since we're looking for silver lining, it is a human error. I mean, it's obvious. I don't know whose side is guilty. Maybe both sides, but it is a human error. And comparing to all historical tragedies and disasters that each side experienced from each other, say it experienced, it was always a political story, and now it has a chance to just be understood as a human error, and yet. I think Piotr is completely correct. It is historians and sort of public intellectuals' role to concentrate on the reconciling part of it rather than playing a blame game. And I think that is something that should continue and go on with.
Okay, Piotr Dutkiewicz, let me bring some politics to the discussion now. Lech Kaczynski's nationalism, his support of former Soviet satellites like Ukraine and Georgia. Those we've talked about already today were not popular with a lot of the Russian leadership, nor necessarily with the European Union. Does Poland, in your view, have to accept that Russia has a sphere of influence still in the 21st century?
I don't think so. We don't have to accept. Means European Union is not accepting that notion. Quite the opposite. The problem is that all countries, both European Union and Russia, in fact, they have the real interests in the close neighborhood. And they are struggling for the influence, and it will continue inevitably. Russians have their own deep entrenched interest in Ukraine, and European Union is moving to Ukraine. Obviously, they will clash, and they are clashing, and they will clash. They will continue to clash. The problem is the civility of this clash. It's how we reconcile the interests, not reconcile the emotions and historical grievances.
Okay, Jeff, we want to talk brass knuckles politics,
Yes.
national interests and all that here? Does Poland have to accept a Russian sphere of influence?
No, and it's certainly not. It's not doing that. And I think that even with the passing of President Kaczynski's, that's not going to change. I mean, Russia is not pursuing global domination. It is not a kind of a Marxist-Leninist power pursuing world revolution. But it is a country that's trying to reconstruct a sphere of influence, trying to reconstruct a strong state in its neighborhood. And it includes Ukraine in that neighborhood. There is no doubt about that. It includes Belarus in that neighborhood.
Does it include Poland?
Well, I don't think so, and that's the interesting thing here. But what is also true is that the EU itself is not speaking with a single voice here. The Germans and the French appear to be more than willing to reconcile with a reassertion of German power. They're willing to do that because Russia controls one very important weapon that they wield quite strategically, and that's the energy weapon. And they're building a pipeline that goes around Poland. And this is clearly designed in order to free up Russia to maneuver in the region. The Russians have come through my center at the University of Toronto several times and said, we pursue every trade with strategic interests in mind. They're quite open about that at this point. Putin's people are.
Sergei.
Talking about energy, a few weeks ago, in fact, before President Kaczynski's death, the two premiers, Putin and Tusk, signed a new energy agreement between Russia and Poland, by which the supplies of gas to Poland will increase significantly, and there will be more pipelines. The volume of gas pumped through Poland to Europe will also increase, which will be economically very, very important for Poland. And it is a kind of another sign. So you don't have to build around Poland. You build around Poland, and at the same time, you also pump through Poland. That's a somewhat different take on the energy policy than the one we saw before.
Let's get Piotr Wrobel.
Well, yes, although the Nord Stream pipeline bypasses Poland, obviously.
It will be built.
This is economically against Poland. And the first impression when the Poles realized about this years ago, the first impression was so strong that our Minister of Foreign Affairs, exaggerated a bit and compared the deal to Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Then he apologized, of course, because this comparison was obviously wrong. But this was against Poland. And a former German chancellor, who's a director of a Russian project.
It's an international project.
Yes, German-Russian.
Okay, let's do. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes. Let me do one more thing here. Nina, I'll ask you this in our last 2 minutes here. Adam Michnik, famous Polish writer, intellectual, said after the crash in Smolensk, quote, "Poles are the Russians of Europe. Russians are the Poles of Asia." In spite of it all, do these two peoples, in fact, have a special bond?
I think they do. And I think the animosity they've been experiencing, in fact, suggests that they do. It's just there's so many things get in the way, opposites attract, but also opposites fight. There's too much history. There's too much closeness. I mean, I do know Adam Michnik rather well, and he and I are always fascinated by how similar indeed we are. And I think that is really a great line. It's a very Michnik line. It probably doesn't leave us with nothing much but just a great metaphor, and yet it does explain the relationship. I think we do have a lot in common, and that's why it is quite a shame that history got in the way on a possibly absolutely wonderful, great, close, and very fruitful and meaningful relationship.
Sergei, I got 20 seconds.
Poles and Russians are close relatives, both to the French And to the Chinese out there, they look almost the same. Okay?
On that absurd note, that's where we're leaving this discussion tonight. No, it's okay, maybe it's real. Can I thank our guests out of town? Nina Khrushcheva, a professor of media and culture at the New School in New York City. Piotr Dutkiewicz, the political scientist at Carleton University in Ottawa. Thank you, too, for being there on the line for us in those wonderful cities. Here in our studios in Toronto, Piotr Wrobel, the historian at the U of T, Sergei Plekhanov, the political scientist at York University, and on the other side of the table, Jeffrey Kopstein, political scientist at the University of Toronto. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.